On Christmas Eve in 1989, a band of more than 150 insurgents crossed the border into northern Liberia from Côte d'Ivoire. They were members of a newly formed group, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, the NPFL, headed by a Liberian exile, Charles Taylor. The attacks by this group, which launched a campaign to oust the dictatorship of President Samuel Doe, effectively triggered a war that brought the almost complete destruction of Africa's oldest republic. Charles Taylor, the leader of the NPFL, was a relatively obscure figure at the time, but he was to become West Africa's most notorious warlord. He had the singular honor of starting a bloody civil war on Christmas Eve of 1989 and subsequently winning both the presidential and parliamentary vote in an election that was declared free and fair by the international community. Charles Taylor's story involves power, conflict, and a legacy that has had an indelible impact not just on Liberia but on the entire West African region. To appreciate the dynamics of Charles Taylor's paradoxical transformation, one must trace his rebellious career both as a student activist and then in national politics. Charles MacArthur Gankay Taylor was born on January 28, 1948 in the Monserrado settlement of Arthington, one of the established settler communities along the St. Paul River near Monrovia. He was raised in a family that had a mix of native Liberian and Americo-Liberian heritage. As for Liberia, it was founded as a colony by the American Colonization Society in 1822. The society believed that African Americans would have better opportunities for freedom and prosperity in Africa, so they arranged for the transportation of freed African Americans to the colony. The settlers eventually declared independence on July 26, 1847, creating the Republic of Liberia. Despite their origins, the settlers, or the Americo-Liberians as they are called, maintained a system of inequality, often treating the native population as second-class citizens. This contributed to the long-standing tensions between different ethnic groups in the country. The Americo-Liberians constituted less than 2% of Liberia's population, but in the 19th and early 20th century, they made up nearly 100% of qualified voters. The dominant political party was the Americo-Liberian True Whig Party, the TWP. Founded in the 19th century, the TWP's grip on Liberian politics was undeniable. Every Liberian president hailed from this party, making it one of the world's longest reigning political entities. Charles Taylor's father, Nelson, worked as a teacher, lawyer, and a judge and was an Americo-Liberian. His mother, Zoe, was a native Gola tribeswoman. The family was neither extremely poor nor exceptionally wealthy, providing the young Charles with a somewhat middle-class upbringing. His early life was marked by a keen interest in education, and he was noted to be quite ambitious from a very young age. When Charles Taylor reached the age of 13, he moved to a missionary Baptist school called the Ricks Institute. Ricks Institute was one of the most prestigious high schools in Liberia, where most of the other students were from the affluent Monrovian Americo-Liberian families. But as a youth, Charles Taylor began to prove as unruly as he was industrious in the classroom, and he soon got a bad name with the teaching staff. In one peculiar incident, he responded to a reprimand by baring his buttocks in the middle of class and shortly afterwards urinating in the schoolyard as well. It was not long before cheeky young Charles Taylor was expelled from Ricks Institute. Nevertheless, through his own efforts, Charles Taylor managed to get onto a government-sponsored teacher training program at the Kakata Rural Teachers Training Institute, which allowed students to finish their high school education while at the same time training as teachers. Finally, after qualifying at the age of 19, Charles Taylor set out to tackle his first job of adulthood, which was teaching science and mathematics in Bomi County. In 1968, Taylor returned to Arthington, where he continued teaching mathematics and science courses. However, the life at Arthington was too restrictive for the now 20-year-old Charles, who was by now eager for a real advancement in life. So in this regard, Charles Taylor moved to Monrovia and continued teaching, and soon things began to move into a higher gear and new horizons opened up. In 1971, following the death of President William Tubman, the incoming President William Taube's regime launched an initiative to improve standards at the Finance Ministry, and so they instituted an open examination to recruit new talent. Charles Taylor scored well enough in this examination to be offered a job as a full-time junior accountant in William Talbot's Ministry of Finance. A life-changing moment occurred which set Charles on a new path and probably altered the course of his life. In this instance, he had a girlfriend taken away from him by one of his old friends from Rick's Institute who had just come back from the United States with a master's degree. Now, because of this ordeal, Taylor began the process to speed his travel to the United States for further studies. And so in 1972, Charles Taylor was on his way to the United States to further his studies. The first stop for Charles was Chamberlain Junior College, which at the time was mostly a school for aspiring fashion designers and was popular with girls from the local Boston society. In some ways, this suited Charles Taylor just fine. Afterwards, he enrolled at Bentley College in Massachusetts, majoring in economics. Beyond academics, this period of Charles Taylor's life was also a time of political awakening. He joined the Union of Liberian Associations in the Americas, the ULAA, an umbrella organization representing some 35,000 Liberian students and other immigrants living in the United States, becoming the chairman of its board of directors. Characteristic of the later insurgent movement, of which he consequently became leader, Charles Taylor was one of a few Americo-Liberians among an otherwise predominantly indigenous association. During this time, his exposure to both Western education and the political ideologies of the time began shaping Charles Taylor's aspirations for Liberia, a nation that was experiencing its own set of challenges during the 1970s, such as political instability and social inequality. The new president of Liberia, William Talbot, had tried to bridge the gap between Americo-Liberians and the indigenous tribal peoples of Liberia. President Talbot stressed the importance of efficiency and initiated programs to help the poor. At the same time, however, his regime was also notorious for corruption and nepotism, which led to frustration and anger within the country. Charles Taylor soon developed a reputation as an outspoken critic of President William Talbot. In 1979, during President Talbot's visit to New York, Taylor led a noisy demonstration outside the Liberian mission to the United Nations. Now, rather than ignore the protesters, President Talbot engaged Taylor in a bantering debate, and this war ordeal had the unintended consequence of instantly enhancing Charles Taylor's stature and reputation, earning him admirers both in the United States as well as in Liberia. This protest that Charles Taylor had led in New York was by no means the only display of Taylor's anti-Talbot disobedience. At the time of the rice riots in Liberia, Charles Taylor had reportedly advocated buying arms and storming the Liberian embassy. These events in the late 1970s marked the first steps on a path to power for Charles Taylor, which would increasingly be characterized by assertiveness as well as brute force, and which would blend the power of his natural popularity with a more ruthless approach to achieve his goals. In February 1980, the elderly President Talbot invited Taylor and other ULAA delegates to come home to Liberia and lend their skills and education to the country. President Talbot invited the young upstarts to advise him how to bring about the reforms within the country, which he said he was sincerely trying to achieve. The president also committed to paying their expenses in Monrovia as well. Charles Taylor returned to Monrovia on the eve of events that would change Liberia as well as his own personal fortunes. The Liberia he found upon his return was rife with rumors and political dissent, with an all-pervasive mood of impending change. This change happened on April 12, 1980. On this day, President William Talbot was murdered during a military coup headed by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, who belonged to a Liberian native tribe. Following this coup, months of bloody retribution by indigenous Liberians against Americo-Liberians ensued, resulting in the overthrow of the long-dominant True Whig Party, the TWP. The Liberian people celebrated the coup d'etat as liberation from Americo-Liberian domination. Major Thomas Kuempa, who was seen as Samuel Doe's right-hand man, along with others, helped stage this coup that took out the TWP and William Talbot. In the aftermath of this bloody coup, Charles Taylor exploited his marriage to his first wife, Tupi Taylor, the niece of Major Thomas Kuempa, who was then the Army Chief of Staff, to secure an appointment as the Director General of the General Services Agency, the GSA, the Government of Liberia's procurement agency. This post in the GSA was a lucrative one for Charles Taylor, and it enabled him to amass a personal fortune by taking commissions on each contract he arranged. It is widely believed that the contacts Charles Taylor established during the performance of his duties in the GSA helped him during his recruitment drive and his later search for finances and weapons. Anyways, Charles Taylor was later replaced as head of the GSA in November of 1983 and eventually demoted to the position of Deputy Minister of Commerce. However, when he was accused of diverting almost $1 million in public funds to a private account, Taylor fled Liberia and apparently entered the United States sometime in late 1983, only to be arrested and imprisoned, awaiting extradition to Liberia after a request from the government of the now President Samuel Doe. When a federal court ruled that sufficient evidence existed to support the Liberian government's request for his return, Charles Taylor escaped from the Plymouth House of Corrections in the United States where he was being held. As one version of the story goes, Charles Taylor convinced a guard to bend the rules at the facility to allow him to pass from the North Wing where he was being held to the East Wing, telling the guard he wanted to play cards with a friend. Once he was there, he used a hacksaw blade to cut through an iron window bar, and using bed sheets tied together, he and 4 other inmates climbed down from the second floor, scaled a fence, and ran into the nearby woods. Meanwhile, President Samuel Doe's dictatorial regime proved no better for the Liberian people than its predecessor. After a coup attempt against him in 1985, led by Major Thomas Kwampa, failed, Samuel Doe responded with brutal atrocities against suspected conspirators and their followers. The president retaliated against tribes such as the Gio and the Mano in the north, where most of the coup plotters had come from, particularly in Nimba County in the northeast of Liberia. Some Liberian northerners fled brutal treatment from the Liberian army into the Ivory Coast. The exact time and detail of Charles Taylor's escape from prison in the United States and arrival in West Africa remains controversial. What is known for certain is that when Charles Taylor arrived in West Africa sometime between November 1985 and April of 1986, he went on an extensive tour of the sub-region seeking support to overthrow the Doe regime. Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana and Libya are believed to have extended diverse kinds of patronage ranging from finance, training grounds, and the supply of traveling documents and armaments to Charles Taylor's burgeoning rebel movement. 2 West African leaders were notable in their assistance to Charles Taylor. One was Côte d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny, an old ally of the Tobet family who had personal reasons for detesting Samuel Doe's regime. Charles Taylor's other main regional supporter was Burkina Faso's leader Blaise Compaoré, who had seized power in 1987 allegedly with the help of a squad of Liberian exiles. Blaise Compaoré provided Charles Taylor with a training base and arms supplies and loaned him some other regular soldiers. Charles Taylor's forces also included a number of dissidents from Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana, and the Gambia. Controversy surrounds the issue of why and how Charles Taylor became the leader of these exiled Liberian opposition groups. One school of thought argues that with his knowledge of procurement procedures and his extensive contacts, Taylor was seen by the exiled Liberian opposition groups as a good choice. With the leadership question resolved and political support secured, Charles Taylor eventually led his men, who now comprise the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, into Libya, where they were trained in guerrilla tactics and the use of weapons at the Wheeler base in Tajura and also at the Mataba base outside Tripoli, Libya's capital. During this time, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi was always looking for ways to undermine pro-American regimes, of which Samuel Doe's regime in Liberia was pro-American. After several false starts, Charles Taylor was ready by late 1989 to launch his rebellion. His NPFL insurgents, numbering about 150, invaded Nimba County, an area occupied by the Gio and Mano tribesmen who had suffered terrible repression in the wake of the failed coup in 1985. Several key figures in Taylor's movement were Gio exiles with a local following. As Charles Taylor had anticipated, Samuel Doe dispatched a force of his fellow Kran tribesmen to Nimba County to crush Taylor's rebels. Samuel Doe's army unleashed a campaign of terror against the local population, and this ensuing repression provided Charles Taylor with an army of raw recruits, mainly illiterate teenagers and boys hell-bent on revenge against Samuel Doe. Taylor gave these new recruits rudimentary training and sent them into battle with the promise of loot. Orphans were organized into small boys units, and to add to their numbers, Charles Taylor opened up prisons in towns he captured, arming the inmates. Marauding gangs swept through the countryside. Bolstered by alcohol, marijuana, and cheap amphetamines, youth and boy soldiers evolved into psychopathic killers, adorning themselves with women's wigs, dresses, fright masks, and enemy bones, as well as smearing their faces with white clay and makeup in the belief that this gave them supernatural protection. One of the important members of Charles Taylor's movement was a man by the name Prince Yomi Johnson. Prince Johnson allied with Charles Taylor, serving as the NPFL's chief training officer. It is worth mentioning that relations between the two leaders had been strained since the outset of the campaign. Finally, Prince Yomi Johnson and his other commanders broke away from the NPFL to form the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, the INPFL, which went on to fight against Samuel Doe's AFL independently, also with the sole objective of removing President Samuel Doe, but remaining a smaller, generally more disciplined army than Charles Taylor's force. By July 1990, rebel forces had advanced into the capital city of Monrovia, but President Samuel Doe refused to yield power. Amid the anarchy, he remained holed up in the executive mansion, refusing all pleas for him to go into exile. In between bouts of fighting, Samuel Doe whiled away the time, playing drafts with his aides, watching old movies, and chatting on a radio-telephone link to the BBC or his wife Nancy, who had left for England, where their children were at school. In an attempt to halt the carnage happening in Liberia, a group of West African states assembled a peacekeeping force intended to separate the combatants. Nigeria contributed the bulk of the force, known as the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group, ECOMOG. After a ceasefire had been arranged, an advance party of ECOMOG troops arrived in Monrovia on August 23 and set up headquarters in the free port. The surrounding area was controlled by Prince Yomi Johnson's fighters, who often dropped in at ECOMOG's headquarters unannounced, armed to the teeth, and held impromptu parties. On September 9, 1990, President Samuel Doe decided to leave the safety of his executive mansion to pay a visit to ECOMOG headquarters, accompanied by 70 Kran soldiers. Tipped off about Doe's movements, Prince Yomi Johnson's rebel group launched a raid on the port to capture him. After a prolonged gun battle, Samuel Doe was caught and taken to a bungalow in the residential compound that Prince Yomi Johnson used as his headquarters. Prince Yomi Johnson's forces brutally killed President Samuel Doe, and this gruesome execution was videotaped and broadcast around the world. Following the assassination of President Samuel Doe, Prince Yomi Johnson made a claim to power that was eventually dismissed as his former friend and colleague Charles Taylor consolidated dominance over other rebel factions. With ECOMOG troops holding the ring in Monrovia, a new interim government of national unity was announced in Liberia. Determined to capture the presidency himself, however, Charles Taylor refused to participate in the interim arrangement and fought on, attacking ECOMOG positions in the eastern suburbs.
We will fight to the last man. I will get weapons from wherever I have to get it. If the Pentagon's got some, please give me some. I'll use it. We are not a military group here. I'm not a soldier. What we seek to do is to destroy these military dictatorships around Africa. And that's that Charles Taylor virus. If the civilians can throw out the army, wow, we are in trouble. That's that virus. Well, I love it.
ECOMOG retaliated with air raids on Taylor's positions, joining the war as yet another faction in it. Like other factions, ECOMOG was heavily involved in looting, arms trading, and contraband. Senior officers in ECOMOG supplied various factions with weapons and other war materials in return for looted goods. Thwarted in his bid to take the capital, Taylor established his own regime outside Monrovia in what became known as Greater Liberia, setting up a commercial empire there, trading in gold, diamonds, iron ore, and timber. Some of Taylor's commercial links, especially in the early years of the war, were with the British and French firms involved in iron ore mining in the region. French firms were also heavily involved in timber exports from the NPFL, largely through Côte d'Ivoire. Added to this was the trade in looted goods, stolen cars, building materials, office equipment, and things as basic as street lights. Charles Taylor's ambitions, however, were not confined to Liberia. He set his sights on neighboring Sierra Leone, whose government had provided ECOMOG with a rear base just north of the capital, Freetown, and sent troops to Liberia in support of ECOMOG's operation there. What particularly attracted Taylor to Sierra Leone were the rich alluvial diamond fields of Côte, less than 160 kilometers from the Liberian border. The diamond fields of Sierra Leone were its most valuable asset. These diamond fields remained in the hands of private entrepreneurs, producing a trade worth at least $300 million a year, most of it smuggled out of the country, leaving the government with minimal income. On 23 March 1991, a group of about 100 fighters, armed and financed by Charles Taylor, crossed the border from Greater Liberia into Sierra Leone and captured several border villages. Calling themselves the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, they included Sierra Leonean dissidents, hardened NPFL units, and a number of mercenaries from Burkina Faso. Their leader, Fode Sanko, was a 54-year-old former corporal in the Sierra Leone army whom Taylor had met in a training camp in Libya. The RUF claimed to be fighting against government officials and their business associates in Freetown who were engaged in plundering the country's resources. But the RUF's principal purpose was to gain control of the diamond fields of Côte for itself and for Charles Taylor. Within a few weeks, the RUF succeeded in overrunning a string of towns and diamond-producing areas in the east of Sierra Leone. The organization also routinely conscripted civilians to work as slave labor in mines or as porters, beating or killing anyone who resisted. Hundreds of thousands of people fled their homes to escape the RUF's campaign of terror. Over time, failure to militarily succeed and numerous setbacks persuaded Charles Taylor that he would never attain power through military means alone. He therefore set out to reach an accommodation with ECOMOG and its Nigerian backers, believing that he could manipulate his way to the top through negotiation. This wrangling took more than 2 years to resolve. A series of peace accords came and went before a deal was finally struck in Abuja, the Nigerian capital, in August of 1995. Under the terms of the Abuja Agreement, signed by 8 faction leaders, Liberia was to be run for an interim period before elections by a Council of State consisting of 6 members, including Charles Taylor representing the NPFL and 2 other warlords. However, neither the wrangling nor the scramble for spoils stopped. A struggle for control of the diamond trade soon turned violent. In April of 1996, Charles Taylor's forces and Crown factions fought for control of Monrovia once more. Once more, Monrovia was reduced to a wrecked city. 4 months later, in August of 1996, Liberia's warlords assembled in Abuja once again to sign a new peace accord. This time, West African governments demanded rigorous compliance, threatening the warlords with penalties, including freezing their assets, a travel ban, and the possibility of war crimes prosecution. Having regained considerable chunks of territory, Charles Taylor now saw the peace process as a means to legitimize his climb to power, and so he complied. Along with the other warlords, he converted his militia into a political party and agreed to participate in demobilization and disarmament schemes. Charles Taylor's NPFL was converted into the National Patriotic Front, the NPP. In the elections held in July 1997, Charles Taylor's NPP gained a decisive victory, securing 75% of the vote, 49 out of 64 seats in the National Assembly, and 21 out of 26 seats in the Senate. Charles Taylor was inaugurated as the 22nd President of the Republic of Liberia on August 2, 1997. The election, despite difficulties, was judged free and fair by the international community. The question that arises, however, is why so many Liberians, after what they had been put through, turned around and gave their votes to one of the principal architects of their misery. The explanation that has acquired currency is that Liberians did not vote for Taylor out of love for the man, but from a desire for peace and stability. Many Liberians believed that if Taylor lost the election, Liberia would return to war. Another factor that contributed to Charles Taylor's success was his access to an estimated $250 million in annual revenues from his thriving business empire. The resources he was able to pour into his campaign were far greater than any other party and included control of Liberia's only nationwide shortwave radio station, the use of a helicopter, and widespread distribution of t-shirts and rice. Perhaps, however, the most significant factor contributing to Taylor's electoral sweep was his opponents. Even Charles Taylor's principal rival, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, had problems with credibility. Voters with long memories recalled her backing the brutal Samuel Doe and even her endorsement of Charles Taylor early in the Civil War. Also, having lived abroad for more than a decade and only returning to Liberia to contest the election, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf appeared detached from the sufferings of ordinary Liberians. After more than 7 years of a brutal civil war, preceded by nearly a decade of the increasingly despotic misrule by Samuel Doe, Liberia was in a precarious situation. The institutions of government had completely collapsed, while the structures of vibrant civil society were non-existent. The task of rebuilding Liberia would have required Herculean efforts, and this task fell to a former warlord. Charles Taylor had promised in his inaugural address to build a government that respected human rights, stating that he was committed to an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and equal protection of the law. Taylor also promised that no recriminations would be carried out against his opponents. At first, he seemed to honor the pledge, inviting members of the opposition to participate in rebuilding the country. However, Charles Taylor soon turned to consolidate his power and institutionalize his control over Liberian society. President Charles Taylor forced 2,500 armed forces of Liberian soldiers, including most of the remaining Crown officers, into retirement, replacing them with veterans of his NPFL. The president also established anti-terrorist units, the ATUs. Most of the members of the ATUs were recruited from abroad to ensure their loyalty to the president above any domestic Liberian considerations. The ranks of this private army swelled after the demobilization of the RUF in neighboring Sierra Leone. With Charles Taylor's regime diverting funding to the ATUs, the regular armed forces of Liberia resorted to looting to pay themselves, using a pretense for the continuing civil conflict between the government and the new emerging rebel forces and other dissident groups that were emerging in Liberia. In this new Liberia, freedom of the press remained alive insofar as journalists were allowed to write or broadcast what they wanted if they were willing to suffer the consequences. Critics of the Taylor government were increasingly subjected to routine harassment, with the more articulate among them being arrested, tortured, and imprisoned. Now, even as the Taylor government cracked down on political dissent, it was unable to improve the general situation in the country. With the Liberian economy in shambles, crime and insecurity plagued the lives of civilians throughout Charles Taylor's presidency. Charles Taylor did well out of the war in Sierra Leone. Most of the country's diamonds during the war years were smuggled through Liberia and handled by traders acting on behalf of Charles Taylor. Essentially, Charles Taylor was running a gangster economy well attuned to enhancing his private fortune. As well as his involvement with the RUF, Charles Taylor dabbled in other regional rebellions, hoping to profit from them. He liked to boast that Liberia possessed the most effective guerrilla fighters in Africa. Taylor sponsored a rebel group from Guinea aiming to overthrow then-President Lansana Conte, providing this rebel group with bases in northern Liberia. However, his meddling soon backfired. Lansana Conte, in turn, began supporting Liberian dissidents who were aiming to overthrow Charles Taylor. In 1999, a new group calling itself Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, the LURD, an assortment of anti-Taylor factions, gained a foothold in Lofa County in northwest Liberia, using Guinea as a rear base. Incensed by the havoc that Taylor continued to wreak in Liberia and abroad, Western governments imposed an arms embargo and trade sanctions on Liberia and a travel ban on government officials. Meanwhile, a United Nations panel of experts was set up to investigate and monitor Charles Taylor's activities, and a United Nations-backed tribunal indicted him for war crimes in Sierra Leone. Charles Taylor was in Accra, Ghana, attending peace talks when the news came through that he had been indicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone on June 4, 2003. Immediately after receiving the news, he fled back to Liberia, fearing arrest. The end of the Charles Taylor era was as chaotic and violent as its beginning. During the course of 2003, LURD forces made rapid advances towards Monrovia, looting, raping and abducting children in similar fashion to Charles Taylor's forces. A second rebel group, the Movement for Democracy and Elections in Liberia, MODEL, gained control of the south and east. For weeks, fighting raged on the outskirts of Monrovia, with tens of thousands of residents seeking refuge in the city center without food or water. Ministries were looted by their own staff and the government ceased functioning. Amid this chaos, Charles Taylor repeatedly promised to stand down as president, but he continued stalling from one week to the next.
And let me reiterate, let nobody have any concerns about will President Taylor step down. I will step down. And you see, over the past several days, they've logged thousands of rockets in Monrovia, killed more than 1,000 people. If I were not here...
In August, a West African peacekeeping force led by the Nigerians arrived in the capital amid scenes of popular rejoicing among the civilian population desperate for an end to their ordeal. 2 months later, a deal between the United Nations, the United States, the African Union and ECOWAS was struck to get Charles Taylor out of Liberia. In an elaborate ceremony on 11 August, attended by a gospel choir and a trio of African presidents, Charles Taylor made his farewell speech. He boarded a plane for Nigeria, where he had been granted sanctuary and a sumptuous villa to enjoy a comfortable retirement. Charles Taylor's time in Nigeria did not go unchallenged. Civil society and others were still pushing for him to answer the charges against him in the indictment from the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Eventually, the new Liberian president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, asked for Charles Taylor to be returned to Liberia. On March 25, 2006, Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo informed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf that Liberia was free to take Charles Taylor into its custody. Within 48 hours, Charles Taylor went missing from his villa in Nigeria, and Nigerian officials raised the alarm and ordered his arrest. Charles Taylor was caught by officials as he tried to cross the Cameroon border in a Range Rover. Citing fears over instability in Liberia if Charles Taylor were tried in neighboring Sierra Leone, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf begged a bid to have Taylor's trial moved to The Hague. The Dutch government asked for a Security Council resolution to authorize the transfer and said it would host Charles Taylor's trial on the condition that another country agreed in advance to take Taylor after his trial had finished. The United Kingdom agreed. After some delays, Charles Taylor's trial began in earnest on January 7, 2008 in The Hague. On April 26, 2012, Charles Taylor was found guilty of abating horrific war crimes including rape and mutilation in Sierra Leone. Charles Taylor was found guilty of aiding and abating a notoriously brutal rebel force that murdered, raped, forced sexual slavery, built a child army, and mined diamonds to pay for guns. Charles Taylor is serving out his 50-year sentence in a prison in the United Kingdom. Don't be shy to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.